Welcome to episode 17 of The Comic Source. I'm your host, Jace. In the news, DC had recently announced that its upcoming Harley Quinn annual, which comes out October 29th, was going to be a rub and smell issue. Well, the 4 smells that are contained in the issue were announced today, and those smells are leather, suntan lotion, pizza, and a 4th smell that, well, let's just say, even though it's not a Spider-Man comic, I have a feeling you'll know what Mary Jane smells like. Over on the Marvel side of things, the Milo Manara variant cover for Spider-Woman created quite a stir. A lot of people felt that the image was too provocative. Well, Milo was scheduled to do 2 other variants for Marvel. A variant for the cover of Thor #2 and also a variant cover for X-Men Avengers Access. Both those variants by Milo have been canceled, although Axel Alonso said that they will do Milo Manara variants eventually. Also in Marvel news, on the cinematic side of things, Bryan Singer has been signed on as the director for the next X-Men film that will be X-Men Apocalypse. That film is supposed to take place about a decade after the end of X-Men Days of Future Past, so it'll be the 1980s, and that film is supposed to tell the origin of Apocalypse. The first book I'm going to talk about is Star Spangled War Stories starring G.I. Zombie from DC Comics. This series is written by Jimmy Palmiotti and Justin Gray, and the art is handled by Scott Hampton. Now, with a name like G.I. Zombie, you would expect this to be a war comic, but in fact it's very different from the war comics that DC has produced in the past. This book is much more about modern warfare, and in fact the first story arc has the main character G.I. Zombie going up against domestic terrorists. So far, Palmiotti and Gray have done a great job blending action with some tongue-in-cheek zombie humor. And as I said, this book is nothing like what I expected it to be, but what it is just a lot of fun. Only 3 issues have come out so far, issue 1, issue 2, and then this month a Future's End issue, which gives us a glimpse into a possible future. What's really cool about that Future's End issue is Palmiotti and Gray, even though it doesn't necessarily continue the narrative from the first 2 issues, they throw enough little tidbits in there to kind of give you a better idea of who G.I. Zombie is, who he works for, and I really enjoyed the story. So with only a few issues out, it's hard to really get into the meat and bones of this series, but I wanted to mention it because it is so new. You can easily go out and pick up the first 3 issues and get on board. I know we're in for a great ride. Palmiotti and Gray had a huge long run on Jonah Hex. It was extremely enjoyable. I enjoy just about everything these guys do. They don't take themselves too seriously. Well, what they do is just produce really enjoyable comics. So if you're looking for something that's not just your standard superhero fare from DC, I strongly suggest you give Star Spangled War Stories starring G.I. Zombie a try. Oh, one more quick thing about the art that's done by Scott Hampton. It's fully painted in color, and it's just gorgeous. Again, something a little different, just like the story's a little different from your standard superhero stories. The art is a little bit different. It suits the mood of the book. It suits the sort of slight horror feel of the book. And some of the splash pages are just stunning. So great job, Scott. The next series I'm going to talk about is Harbinger from Valiant Comics. This just concluded its run with issue 25. There were also 2 0 issues put out, so that brings the total of issues up to 27. Before I get into the series itself, I'm going to go over the main characters. Now, Peter Stanchek is the primary protagonist of the series. We see that he's an extremely powerful psiot. That's sort of the Valiant universe's version of a mutant. He's one of the very, very, very rare psiots that was born activated, which means his powers were available to him from birth. And he's in fact so powerful that he's able to switch on the powers of others who have this latent ability to become a psiot. Not everybody has these abilities, but Peter, throughout the course of the story, seeks out some that do, in order to help him with his war against the primary antagonist of the series, Toyo Harada. Toyo Harada is sort of the flip side of the coin to Pete. He was not born activated. He had his powers activated by the dropping of the first atomic bomb during World War II. And he believes he knows what's best for the human race, and he's going to do whatever it takes to have the future he believes in come to pass, whether that means manipulating stock markets, shady business deals, all the way up to and including people dying because of actions that he takes. Another one of the main characters is Chris Hathaway. Now, Chris is a member of the team who doesn't have powers, but she's an extremely brilliant tactician. Next, we have Faith Hebert. She has the ability to fly, and she was the first sort of latent psiot that Pete was able to activate and turn on her powers. Also on the team is Charlene Dupree, otherwise known as Flamingo. She has flame-based powers. She can shoot fire from her mouth or her hands, and she can light her whole body on fire. There's even been cases where she used it to fly. Also on the team is John Torkelson. He's a crippled young teenager, but he has the ability with his mind to create sort of a light hard shell projection, and his body is kind of stored inside the center of that projection. That projection is pretty much invulnerable and extremely strong. There have been instances where that projection had grown to a huge size due to John feeling unsafe in his environment, and to sort of compensate, his hard shell, if you will, got a lot bigger. So the series starts out with the first 5 issues entitled Omega Rising. This is kind of an introduction to Peter and Toyo. When we first meet Peter, he's on the run. He's escaped from a mental hospital. He's kind of self-medicating in order to keep out all the voices that he hears. He can't filter out other people's thoughts. When he's walking down the street, he's just bombarded with the thoughts of all the people around him. So he's drugging himself in order to kind of get some peace and quiet, but it certainly seems like it's no way to live. In these first 5 issues, he's approached by Toyo Harada to recruit him to his Harbinger Foundation, where he trains young Psyops like Peter in order to further his plans of controlling the world and manipulating world events in order for things to go his way. Through the course of the first 5 issues, we see that Peter and Toyo have philosophical differences. It comes to a head in a big battle in issue 5, where Pete basically says that he's never going to follow Toyo and is in fact diametrically opposed to the things that Toyo does. The second 5-issue story arc, Renegades, is about Faith and Pete, who escaped the Harbinger Foundation, reaching out to Pete's childhood friend Chris Hathaway for her help in deciding what to do next. And Chris decides that even though Toyo Harada is an extremely powerful individual, and though they may die, they'll die plotting. So they decide to reach out to some more Psyops who are unactivated. Pete, using his powers, activates them, and they become this team, the Renegades, whose primary purpose is to find a way to stop Harada. Those 2 members that join the team are John Torkelson, Torque, and Charlene Dupree, Flamingo. The third story arc spinning out of that covers issues 11 through 14, and that's Harbinger Wars. Now that crosses over with the Bloodshot title from Valiant, and it's a story that gives some background on Bloodshot. Bloodshot was kind of a cyborg, for lack of a better term. He's a man that has many microscopic machines in his blood called nanites that allow him to have senses and abilities far beyond what a normal person would have. He had been used by an organization called PRS, Project Rising Spirit, to recruit Psyops for their own evil purposes. And they didn't have a powerful Psyop to activate their Psyops, so the way that they activated these latent powers in the children that they recruited was through torture. They managed to get a team together of these Psyops, a combat team known as Generation Zero, and anytime those kids stepped out of line or managed to escape, the Psyop killer, Bloodshot, was sent to retrieve them. So things have sort of come to a head between the Harbinger Foundation of Toyo Harada and Project Rising Spirit. Generation Zero is another team that's on the table, as well as the team of Renegades from Harbinger. So there's a lot of moving pieces going on in the Harbinger Wars. Generation Zero has escaped from Project Rising Spirit. Bloodshot's trying to help them. He realizes that he had been used by Project Rising Spirit, and he's trying to become his own man and right the wrongs of his past. But Generation Zero still sees him as sort of a boogeyman, so they're fighting against him, not realizing he's trying to help. Meanwhile, the Renegades are heading to Vegas, where Generation Zero has taken over a hotel. They have hostages. So you have all these different factions coming together. Meanwhile, Toyo Harada sees this as an opportunity. He wants these kids for his own. He believes he knows what's best for them. So at the end of the story, we think that they've escaped from Harada, who's come to take the Generation Zero kids away, but come to find out they've in fact been captured. Which leads into the next story arc, A Perfect Day. That covers issues 15 through 19. And what we find out is they've been captured by Toyo Harada. They've been put in these sort of suspended animation tanks, and it's sort of a virtual prison. And throughout the course of these issues, they realize that they are in fact not free, that they have been captured by Toyo, and they have to find a way to break free. Following the end of this arc, they're really faced with a tough decision. They realize now the danger that they're in. The path they've chosen is extremely dangerous, and they're not sure if they should carry on or not. Peter's ready to call it quits, but he's convinced by the others that this is an undertaking worth the risk, and they decide to continue to try to overthrow Harada. The next two issues are subtitled Resistance, and it's about a young boy, Axe, who is not a Psyot, but is an extremely gifted hacker. He's found a way to break into PRS and leaks a lot of their information online. Now, a lot of the things that are leaked online, these people with powers, these crazy ideas and technology that seem to be straight out of a science fiction movie, are met with ridicule and disbelief by the general public. So with the Renegade's help, he manages to break into the Harbinger Foundation's computers, where things are much more detailed, and following the release of the PRS files, they managed to release these files from the Harbinger Foundation, in which case Toyo Harada has been outed to the world as an extremely powerful, ruthless dictator, and he is not happy about it. So those two issues, 22 and 23, are subtitled Death of a Renegade, and it's no joke. One of the renegades does die. It's a very powerful story. It's extremely sad. Having read the series up to this point, you become attached to the characters, but one thing Valiant tries to do is make their stories seem like much more like the world outside your window. They try to be much more realistic in the depiction of people with powers, what would really happen. These kids that have these powers, they're in these extremely dangerous situations. They're not all going to survive. It's just much more realistic to believe that kids that don't have training, because who really is there to train them, that put themselves in these situations are eventually going to get hurt. So the final two issues of the series are kind of the epilogue. It talks about how although the Renegades have achieved a great victory by outing Harada to the world, and the world now knows that he's this megalomaniac, dictator, supervillain type person, they really have, in a way, lost. They've lost their innocence. They've lost one of their family, one of their friends, one of their fellow renegades, and where do they go now? While the series overall was just a huge success for Valiant and a great story by writer Joshua Dysart, he stated at WonderCon earlier this year that the story just couldn't continue because of the way things happen. This story, this first chapter of the Harbingers, is over. Now, a second series has come out since then entitled Harbinger Omegas. The first two issues of those are out, and they sort of focus more on Harada. Okay, now he's been out to the world, where does he go next? So that's sort of a general outline of where the story goes from beginning to end. As I said, the writer Joshua Dysart did an incredible job. In the 90s, with the first go-round of Valiant, I read Harbinger, I enjoyed it, but it doesn't hold a candle to what Joshua Dysart has done here. He's made these characters so three-dimensional, so realistic. You believe their reactions, you believe their interactions. It's easy to see that if this were an actual person in these circumstances, that this is how they would react. As I said before, I feel to me that Pete Stanchek is really the main protagonist of the story, and the growth that he undergoes from issue 1 to issue 25 is very rewarding. It's rewarding to see him go from a very self-centered, self-medicating drug addict to a member of this team who's willing to sacrifice himself for his teammates and really for the whole world. But at the same time, there's part of him that hasn't changed, which also is very realistic. There's still that core of doubt within him. There's still that part of him that just wants to be left alone. And so, again, I feel just a very realistic portrayal of a young 18, 19-year-old man who has the burden of these incredible powers. More so than any other character in the series, Pete really grew a lot. But Pete's not the only one who underwent changes throughout the series. Chris became a little softer. She was very black and white in her beliefs when the series started, and we see her sort of taken down a peg by the things that she's experienced. She knows that she's not invincible by any means, and that just because she feels she knows what the right thing to do is, that sometimes it's not always worth the cost. Faith is probably the character that changed the least throughout the series, but that's just because she was an optimist to start with. She had a big heart. She was always there as the heart and soul of the team, pushing them to do what's right, not to give up, and believing that they had their powers for a reason, and it was their responsibility to help the world as a whole. Charlene also grew a lot throughout the series, mostly in confidence and self-awareness. Torkelson, Torque, he's probably the one that grew the least. He had the least change. He did soften. He wasn't quite so afraid to let people in and to actually experience his emotions. So there was some change. But even at the end of the series, he still seems kind of like a meathead to me. But again, all these characterizations, very realistic. Dysart has quickly become one of my favorite writers. There's nothing I could say to recommend this series highly enough. There are trades out. You can pick up the issues cheaply, and it's just an extremely, extremely great read. I'm just going to do a quick rundown of some of the pencilers on the series. Kari Evans starts out on the series and does a good majority of the pencils. Also handling pencils, Barry Kitson, Clayton Henry, Phil Baronis, Lee Garbett, Pereira Perez, Trevor Hairsine. They all do a good job, I'll say. Not a great job, but a good job. The art is fairly consistent, even though there's a lot of different pencilers. A lot of times the inkers are the same over the pencilers, so the art is fairly consistent. There's not any time where I can remember going from one issue to the next and the change being very jarring. I feel another part of the consistency of the art staying the same throughout the changes in pencilers is due to the colorist on the book. Ian Hannon does the majority of the colors. There's also issues colored by Moose Bauman and Brian Reber. And to a man, they all do an excellent job, and it really helps out with the consistency of the art, as I said. So Harbinger is part of the greater universe of Valiant. It's a great way to get into Valiant. If you've read no Valiant titles so far, this would be the first title I would recommend to you. It crosses over with the rest of the universe enough to give you an idea of what's going on, but at the same time, it's very self-contained. You can just read issues 1 through 25, have an extremely enjoyable time reading it, kind of get an understanding and a feel of what the Valiant universe is all about. And if you decide you want to try out more of the Valiant universe, great. If not, you've read Harbinger, and I would be shocked if you didn't enjoy it. The 2 Zero issues I mentioned earlier are sort of origin issues. There's one that covers the Bleeding Monk. He's a character in the story that's kind of a precog. He says that he knows the future, and he's kind of been manipulating things behind the scenes. And he was an advisor to Harada when the series started, although that role sort of changes for him as the series goes on. The other Zero issue is actually the origin of Harada. We see his powers being activated when the bomb drops during World War II, and kind of his journey from that child that was orphaned in Japan, learning to use his powers on his own, through his rise up to becoming this head of this multinational corporation, Harada conglomerate, and the way he decides he knows what's best for the world, and what he's going to do so that that future will come to pass. So I want to thank everybody for watching. Join me next time when I cover Rise of the Magi from Top Cow, and I'll also discuss Marvel's latest Hulk series. I'll see you then.